America is racist, then why, if you're born white and poor, between 1959 and 2018, you were 3.5 times more likely than a black person to remain poor? That's from the U.S. Census data, okay? In fact, according to the U.S. Census, every racial group but white Americans have shown significant reductions in poverty from 1959 to 2018. So let's do the numbers. In 1959, black Americans, poverty rate was 55%, and white America was 18.8%. Roll forward to 1968, which is the passage of the last Civil Rights Act, black poverty fell 20.3% in a 9-year period of time to 34.7%. In the same time period, poverty among white Americans fell from 18.8 to 10%. So let's look at the 50 years from 1968 to 2018. Black poverty went from 34.7% to 20.7%. White poverty went up by a 0.1%. So in the 50-year span from 1968 to 2018, white America showed no reduction of poverty at all. These are not my numbers. These are numbers from the Census Bureau. From 2019 to 2020, under Trump it did fall 5.2%, but that fall was even for blacks and whites. It fell 5.2%. So let's look at this. If there is the idea that America is systemically racist that leads to white privilege is predicated on the idea that there's an economic advantage. If there's no economic advantage, which the Census Bureau says there is not, there could be no white privilege, and there could be no systemic racism. I think those are facts that we need to understand and know, because conservatives are at a vast disadvantage. In the issues of race, when we talk about race, we start at step 2, because we accept the assumption that there is some basis in the racial argument. We just don't know what it is. And so we then argue on their field of play, accepting as a foundation that race is a reality. We are the unfortunate ones. What we do in the next few years will either allow our country to be destroyed or awaken it to a new age of freedom. This is not an exaggeration. America is being torn apart by a lie, and the lie has been used by those who wish to destroy this country from its very founding. The enemies of freedom assert that America was founded on the principles of racism. After the Revolutionary War, Americans came together and we had free states, we had slave states. Do you ever ask yourself why they want one nation? Why not just have slave states in the South and free states in the North? Why not? The answer is that the Founding Fathers believed in the idea that all men were created equal, except because it had never been done before, they did not know what that looked like. So what they said was this: based on the concept, faith in that concept, if we can take the free states, and we can take the slave states, and we can make them one nation, at some point in time, we can work it out. We can work slavery out of the system. And how do we know this? In the 3/5 compromise, that from when I was a child in the South, taught in school, that the 3/5 compromise, where slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person, I was always taught that was a racist action. But it was actually an action meant to undermine slavery. If the slaves were counted as a full person, then they would have had unequal representation or superior representation in Congress, because it's by population. So the 3/5 gave the North an advantage in the legislature, so that they then had the power to pass laws to undermine slavery, which they did. They first stopped the import of slaves from Africa, and they gradually more and more restricted slavery. So I'm going to tell you a story. And the reason I'm going to tell you this story is I don't believe America was ever racist. And I'm going to give you this story, and I think you'll understand it. My son had a friend, Chris. They came back one day, and there were some gentlemen that were causing trouble, and Chris broke out into his kung fu karate stance. Chris is Asian. And his kung fu stance kind of made them nervous, and they kind of bugged off. So my son and his friend comes home, they're laughing. So I said, Chris, what kind of martial arts do you know? Chris starts laughing and goes, I don't need martial arts, I'm the clumsiest person in my family. He goes, and I hate math and I suck at it. And I don't play a musical instrument. So I'm going to ask you a question. Those boys, it's not likely that those boys' parents sat them down and taught them that Asians do martial arts. That conversation, have you ever done that? Sit your kid down and say, well, you know, son, if you have children, friends who are Asian, they know martial arts, so it's really strict. Causes too much trouble because, you know, didn't happen. So where did it come from? It came from the media of the day, controlled by the rich and the powerful, for the sake of making money. Represent all Asians as Kung Fu experts. You sell a lot of movie tickets to Kung Fu movies. You create the mystique. In the South, 1 to 5% of white Americans own slaves. Most slaves are never permitted to leave the plantation. That means about 95% of white Americans never met a black person. You tell me where racist ideas came from. It came from the media of their day. People reflected what they were told. People reflected what the media said, and the media reflected what the politicians said. The politicians reflect what the wealthy say. What a lot of people don't realize is, at one point in time, white America questioned the very fabric of slavery. And what happened is science suddenly emerged that said that blacks were involved to be subservient to whites. I'm going to give you a word. The word is called drapetomania. Anybody know what the DSM is? DSM is the official guide for mental illness in the United States. Okay? So in the DSM, drapetomania was listed. It had an illness, a diagnosis, and a cure. It is proof that people of the day were told that the inferiority of the black man was a matter of settled science. Drapetomania was considered a conjectural mental illness that, in 1851, American physician Samuel Cartwright hypothesized the cause of enslaved Africans fleeing captivity. See, America wasn't comfortable with slavery, and so they said, well, if blacks are evolved to be slaves, why are there slaves trying to escape? Science had the answer, because it's a mental illness. So, let's go here. I'm going to read these words exactly, okay? It says, well, because they contracted a mental illness, Cartwright stated that the malady was a consequence of masters who made themselves too familiar with slaves, treating them as equals. And I quote, if treated kindly, well-fed and clothed, with fuel enough to keep a small fire burning at night, separated into families, each having their own house, not permitted to run about at night to visit their neighbors, to receive visits or use intoxicating liquors, and not overworked or too exposed to weather, they are easily governed, more than any other people in the world. And if anyone and more than at any time is inclined to raise their heads to the level of their master or overseer, humanity and their own good requires that they should be punished until they fall into the submissive state that was intended for them to occupy. They have only to be kept in that state and treated like children to prevent and cure them from running away. You see, Americans believed that slavery was settled science. You heard that word before? Not to be questioned. It was settled science. 80% of the Southern GDP was agriculture. If slaves were free, it would have destroyed 80% of the GDP of the South. At the end of the day, always follow the money, right? Yeah. But wait, there was a treatment for this terrible disease. If it was contracted, in the case of slaves, sulky and dissatisfied without cause, a warning sign of imminent flight, Cartwright recommended, so this was a medical prescription. The medical prescription was to beat the devil out of them. See, you watch television, you have a dialogue that American slavery was so brutal because whites hated blacks, etc., etc. What they don't tell you is the beatings were a medical procedure. There was never the animus. The powerful used the media of their day to control the narrative, to bring people in line. When we look at the Civil War, many people think that it was just up to Abraham Lincoln. It was not. There was still, in the American consciousness, the question of whether or not blacks really wanted to be free. And then there were 3 slave revolts. And those slave revolts is what made them toss Dr. Cartwright's diagnosis. And they said, cannot be a mental illness if so many are seeking to be free. And so after the last slave rebellion, northern whites decided that this had to end. But there was an obstacle. In that day, Abraham Lincoln, like the founding fathers, those in Congress had never actually seen a black person that could operate at an equal level to a white person. And they feared that freeing the blacks would create a permanent underclass. But in that day, the White House was also called the People's House. And Frederick Douglass made a point to knock on the door and to visit Abraham Lincoln and to sit down and have spirited discussions and debates. And it was in that relationship with Frederick Douglass that Abraham Lincoln concluded that the black man one day could indeed stand on equal ground with the white man in one nation under God. And that's how we got the Civil War. It was when people stood up and fought against the popular narratives of the day. See, the proper narrative of slavery is not one of systemic racism infecting the South. The proper narrative is of powerful people manufacturing science to win the compliance of the general population to preserve their power. The wealthy controlled the science. The wealthy controlled the politics. To preserve their own wealth, they needed white Americans to buy into the idea that slavery was science. The wealthy sometimes needs to dehumanize other Americans to maintain their position. And it's the same thing that we're seeing today. The wealthy and the power need to dehumanize us, call us terrorists, to maintain the power. They use the science of CRT and the ideologies, the mechanisms of SEL, to teach our children that we are in fact in error, that we are irrational, that we are unscientific. Jim Crow was created after the Civil War to preserve power for those very same people. People don't realize it. You know, the Prohibition, Three-Fifths Compromise never mentions race. It says those enslaved versus those not enslaved. There were free blacks in the South. And do you know that the entire time of slavery, free blacks voted? Why do you need Jim Crow if they couldn't vote? Think about it. Why do you need laws, poll taxes, literacy tests if blacks weren't already voting? Free blacks were always voting. That's why Jim Crow was created, to stop them from voting. During Reconstruction, the population shift. They always say the first black senator since Reconstruction. What they don't want to tell you is that a Republican president ended slavery, and there were plenty of black senators in Congress. They deny that historical place. They deny that pre-Jim Crow, America was realizing the ideals that the founding fathers put in place. And now, critical race theory masquerades as science. It has its own vocabulary, like microaggression, white privilege, systemic racism, and anti-racism. Intelligent Americans sit around and talk about these ideas like they're real. They talk about these ideas with the same fervor as an enthusiastic Star Wars fan who debates which Jedi is the most powerful. And if someone came from another planet and heard these conversations, they would think that Jedis were real. But like Jedi being a fiction, systemic racism is a fiction. Standing face to face, Americans are Americans. You ever think about this? By 1968, black poverty was reduced to about 34%. That means that during Jim Crow, black poverty went down 66%. That's capitalism at work. Right? 2/3 was reduced under a real system of systemic racism. Because face to face, man to man, woman to woman, hand to hand, people had relationships and they traded and they did business and they did commerce. In fact, the only thing holding it back was the government. People were changing things. CRT and anti-racism rhetoric is a tool, and that's what you have to realize. It is a tool to keep us divided. You ever wonder why it came up so recently? See, first administration of Obama, his first term, he won the election, coming in against Romney, about 47%. Now a trend that people don't really know about is that although black women still voted Democrat, the black man demographic was shifting to conservative. So the only way to preserve, so it would no longer be 47% and 47% decided independence in the middle. Because if you broke off the black male vote, that would give a strong position to future Republican candidates. And it would negate the black advantage on the Democrat side. So what do? They have to reinstitutionalize racism to create a permanent voting class. But it wasn't good enough to deal with the adults because the adults were turning their backs on liberalism. So they had to do it through your children. In Virginia, there are 8 school districts that have double-digit graduation rates. Again. Right? Isn't that horrible? Would it surprise you if I told you that in 4 of those school districts, blacks graduate at double-digit rates over whites? Would it surprise you if I told you that in 40% of the school districts in Virginia, blacks graduate at a higher rate than whites?
It would surprise it.
That in 80% of the school districts, blacks graduate at 90% or above. In fact, if you look at the numbers, we did a study, and in this study, we looked at graduation rates in urban cities, and in all of them except for Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, where blacks did poorly, whites did worse. They'll tell you that in Baltimore, blacks graduate at 73% rate. What they don't tell you is whites graduate at 72 and some change. And it's the same in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles. Shall we go on? That's what they don't want to tell you. See, when they talk about slavery, then they throw in people of color. When you throw in people of color, then you have immigrants whom English is not their first language. So in Baltimore, Hispanics graduate at 54% rate. So what they do is they blame slavery, but blacks are doing too well. So they throw in other people of color to play with the numbers, right? And that's how they win their arguments. That's why they shift back and forth. If they kept it as a pure black argument, they'd lose every time. So they have to play fast and furious with the numbers. So let me conclude here. Elections matter. School boards matter. Policy matters. If we understand our shared history, we can continue the American dream. If we look at the data, we can create a better place for all. When we embrace a colorblind future, we can create a better place for all. The future of this nation and the prosperity of our children will depend upon groups of parents, what groups of parents and patriots like you do over the next few years. We have the misfortune of being born at the crossroads of history. We're going to, well, let me borrow the famous words of Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to update a little bit from modern times. But our fathers brought forth on this continent a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. That battlefield is the hearts and minds of our children and their freedom to prosper. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are to meet on a great battlefield. Brave men and women, living and dead, struggle to give us freedoms, the freedoms we have today. The world will little note nor long remember the words we've said here, but it will never forget what you do once you leave here. For it is for us in this room and beyond to be dedicated here to the unfinished work for which they fought before us and have thus so nobly advanced. We must be dedicated to do the great task remaining before us, that from the honored patriots who founded this nation and the many that have died and sacrificed since, we can take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last measure of devotion, that we were highly resolved that those who fought the cause of liberty before us shall not have struggled in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. That's where we're at. We have to have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from Loudoun County, shall not perish from the Commonwealth of Virginia, it shall not perish from this great nation, and it shall not perish from this earth. Thank you.